Okay, good afternoon, guys. Welcome to the second session this year, second block session this year of Property Economics and Finance 2. We've got a fair amount of work to cover, so I think let's get stuck into it. The way we're going to approach this afternoon is we're going to look at demand and supply first, which is quite a hefty chunk of this quarter's work, and then we'll have a short break of about 10-15 minutes, okay? And then we'll have a look at elasticity, which we basically just touched on this semester. We never really, or this quarter, we never really went into too much detail there because we were running out of time. But we did think it necessary for you to know something about elasticity. It's quite an important concept. And in fact, I saw something on LinkedIn recently, which an article which are uploaded to articles of interest on Blackboard. So it's sitting there if you want to read it, just to show you that some of these concepts are actually used in business. You know, they're not absolutely theoretical. They are actually used in practice. So if you want to read that article, it's quite an interesting article. And then right at the end, we'll discuss a little bit more detail about the exam coming up on the, I think your exam's on the 3rd, afternoon of the 3rd. Is that right? Afternoon of the 3rd. I think it's afternoon of the 3rd. Yeah. 2 o'clock on the 3rd of June. So, yeah, and you'll be writing, those that choose to write the physical will write at the same time as those that choose to do the online exam. Time is exactly the same. Okay. Okay, so let's get stuck into demand and supply. If you remember that when we met last term at the block session, we actually developed the demand curve. So if you remember, it looked something like this. Okay, and this is the demand curve. Okay, so it's a curve that is has on the independent or the independent variable as price and the dependent variable as quantity. So Q is quantity, P is price, and the demand curve looks something like that. Now the slope of this demand curve, as we'll see a little bit later when we do elasticity, is quite important. But for the start of the session, when we discuss demand supply, not that important and not really relevant. So we'll just draw them as such. For easy illustration. Okay, now demand is dependent on a number of things. Now, first off, it's dependent on the price of the product. So the demand of a product is dependent on the price of that product. Okay, it's also dependent on a whole lot of other things, like the prices of related products, other products. Okay, so the demand for a product can change if the price of other products changes. Okay, it can become more attractive or become more unattractive, and we'll look at it in a little bit more detail on with some of those. And just to mention some of the goods, you have complementary goods, and then you have substitute goods. Substitute, in other words, is something that you can substitute for the good. In other words, it's something that is fairly similar and is quite competitive, and you can move from one to the other quite easily. The other thing it's dependent on is the income of the consumer. So the demand for a product is dependent on the income. Okay. Generally, if you're earning more money, you demand more of the product. Okay. It also depends on the taste of the consumer. Your taste might change, and the size of the household. If there's only one in the household, obviously not going to demand too much of that particular good, but if there are 10 of you in the household, it's going to be somewhat different. Okay. So when we take all these elements, we put them into an equation. And the equation looks something like this. So the quantity demanded, and you'll remember this from school days when you studied mathematics, you spoke about a function, is a function of the price of the product, okay? The price of the actual product, okay? Price of price of alternative products or other products. Okay. The income of the consumer. Tastes, as we said, tastes. The number of people in the household, and many other things. So when you're writing this equation or this function, it should be written like this. So the quantity demanded is a function of the price of the product, the price of other products, income, which is Y. Okay, this is Y. T, which is tastes, and the number of people in the household, and many other things. That's what the dot is for. There are many other things that will determine your demand for a particular product. Yeah. So I think is it chapter 5 and 6 or chapter is it chapter 5 and 6? Demand and supply. Chapter 5. Yeah. But I think demand and supply covers 5 and 6. Is it 4? 4. Okay, it's 4 and 5, sorry. So we're starting with chapter 4 here. Chapter 4, yeah, of the book. And I think that by the end of demand and supply, we'll be on chapter 5. Yeah. But most of it's in chapter 4, the first chapter. Okay, so you must remember that you need to put these dots in because that represents many other products. Okay. Now, if we're looking at this graph here, we're only really concerned about the price of the product. Okay. So what we do here now is if we're only concerned about the price, we keep all other things equal. We keep all other things constant. And the way we write this is like this. So this now it reads, the quantity demanded of a product is a function of the price of the product, all other things being equal. And there's a term that we use for all other things being equal, and that is ceteris paribus. It's a Latin phrase. Ceteris paribus. It means all other things being equal. And this function you can write like such. QD is a function of the price of the product, ceteris paribus. Okay, so you can either write it like this, or you can write it like this. Either way. If you write it like this, we need to put the lines at the top of the elements that we're keeping constant. If you're writing it like this, all we do is we put ceteris paribus at the end. Okay, so we're only interested in looking at the price of the product here. All other things are being kept equal or constant. We're not interested in looking at those right now. We're just worried about the price. Okay. Are there any questions so far? This function is very important to know and to understand. And remember, you must put the dots in because it means that there are many other elements that also affect the quantity demanded of a product. Okay. Okay, now, it's very important that we distinguish between, and you've probably seen it in the notes, and you've probably read it in the book as well, movements along the curve and movements of the curve. It's very important to distinguish between the two. Okay, so movements along the curve and then movements of the curve. Okay. It's very important that you are able to distinguish between the two. Now, movements along the curve happen in this situation here. Okay, when we're looking at the price of the product alone, we're only looking at the price of the product and all other things are being kept equal. So here we have the quantity demanded and we have the price of the product. Everything else has been kept equal. And when this is the case, or this is the situation, then we are looking at movements along the curve. Okay, so let's take, for example, let's have a look here. If we have a the price of the product is, say it's P1, okay? And it's quite nice to use color here. And at P1, we find that in terms of the demand curve, that quantity Q1 is demanded. Okay. If then the price increases to a level P2, you'll notice that the demand for the product diminishes to a level Q2. Okay, so in terms of this demand curve at P2, Q2 products are the product are being demanded. Okay, and what you notice here is we have a movement from point A to point B. And that is a movement along the curve. Okay. So we've got a movement here of a movement along the curve from point A to point B. Yeah.
Where is D coming from? How do you determine D, that line?
What, this line here?
Yes, that line. Yeah.
You mean how do we
How do you get?
did you not attend the session last quarter, end of last quarter? We went through the derivation of this. And you can go through it. I mean, it's repeated now in the beginning of these notes. So I'm not repeating it. We went, when we looked at utility, we set up the demand curve. If you want to have a look at it again, in the first couple of pages of these notes, like starts on page 5. Page 5, 6, 7, 8, no, 5, 6, 7. 5, 6, 7 is that they repeat the derivation of the demand curve. But it almost seems obvious that if you're purchasing a particular product, say for example you're purchasing, there's some products that don't move too much. We'll discuss those a little bit later. But say for example you purchase, let's try and think of a useful one. If you think about maybe it's something like a luxury good, like chicken, for example. Say you purchase so many chickens per week for the household, and the price of chickens rises. Okay, so you at this level over here, you are quite keen to consume Q1 chickens. Okay, and the price rises. Generally, if you think about it in real life, generally you're going to probably buy less chickens. You're not going to buy as many chickens. Okay, so you're going to say to the household, listen, chickens have gone up in price. We can't really afford to have chickens 4 times a week or chicken 4 times a week. We'll have chicken 3 times a week. So your demand for the product actually comes off. Okay, so if you think about it logically, that's why it's a backward sloping curve. And when we come to the supply curve, we'll have a look at that as well, and why it's shaped in that fashion. Okay, so this, when we're dealing with the price of the product alone and nothing else, all other things being kept equal, we have movements along the curve. Okay, so you can play around with this, endlessly, and change the prices, and you'll see that how the quantity demanded changes. Okay, and as I say, these curves do change, their steepness changes from time to time depending on the product, and obviously that will affect the amount demanded. Okay, so if it's a steeper curve, for example, let's have a look at a steeper curve quickly. Curve like that. If the price changes, say, the same, you can see that the quantity demanded doesn't fall off quite that dramatically, does it? Whereas if it's a flat curve and the price changes, you can see that the quantity demanded changes quite dramatically. So the slope of the curve does matter, and we'll see a little bit later. We'll go do a couple of examples, okay? But right now we're just having a look at that. Come again? Oh, it's too cold, eh? Sorry, man. I'll put the fan down too. Yeah. If it's too cold, we just turn it off. Okay. Any questions about movements along the curve? It's important that you understand movements along the curve. So if you're dealing with the price of the product only, everything else being kept equal, then we have movements along the curve. Okay, so now on the other hand, if you have a situation like this, okay, we have our demand curve. Okay, it's much the same fashion. And now what we have is some other element here changes. So we're looking at more than just the price of the product. We're looking at some of these other elements. Okay, then we have movement of the curve. So the curve is going to actually move. Okay, so let's take, for example, income. We'll have a look at a few examples just now, but let's just take income. If your income goes up, okay, if the household income goes up, and we eating chickens in the household, normally you're having 4 a week, you think, well, wow, now we can afford chickens every single day, so now we'll have 7 chickens. Okay, so what happens is the curve actually moves. So it's a positive move. So the curve moves out there from D1 to D2. So if this was a case where at P1, is that dripping inside? Okay, so at P1, we were consuming Q1 chickens. The income increases. Okay, your income goes up. Then at the same price, we're looking at consuming Q2 chickens. Okay. So here we have a movement of the curve. Okay. And this only happens when one of the other elements changes, other than the price of the product. Okay. And you must understand this, or be able to distinguish between these two statements. Movements along the curve, okay, we're looking at the price only. Movements of the curve, we're looking at one of the other elements. In this case, we were just using as an example income. If your income increases, then obviously you're going to demand more of the product. So the demand curve moves out. And you can see that the quantity demanded goes from Q1 to Q2. Any questions? It's important that you understand the difference between these two statements. Okay. Movement of the curve, movement along the curve and movement of the curve. Okay, we'll look at a particular example. Okay. Any questions before I rub this off? Before we go and look at a particular example. Okay. So in the notes, let's stick to what they've got in the notes. They use an example there. We're looking at substitutes. In other words, there's a change in price of the product, and we're looking at the demand of a substitute good. Okay. So let's have a look at the one in the notes. It's they look at train tickets and they look at taxi rides. So the one is a substitute for the other one. If train tickets, the price of train tickets changes, then you might opt to take more rides in a taxi, and vice versa. And in fact, it's happened in Cape Town. You think about what's happened in Cape Town over the last couple of years. If you've been in Cape Town for a number of years, that the train system has deteriorated, and what happened is people are taking more taxi rides. Okay, so it wasn't really a case of the price of the tickets going up, as opposed to the actual system breaking down, and people opting for a more efficient system, which is a taxi. and a taxi ride that get you work on time, get you, wherever you're going on time. So, okay. So let's have a look at this example. Train tickets. So we got our usual demand supply curve, okay? And so the price of, and we actually use, say the price of a train ticket went from 3 Rand up to 6 Rand. So it doubled. So this is train tickets. And it's important that you understand this example and also that you label it properly, because this is a great question for an examination. Something like this, along these lines. So what we have here is the price of train tickets went from 3 Rand up to 6 Rand. And you can see the quantity demanded went from 16 tickets down to 8 tickets. Okay. So the price rose, the quantity demanded came down. And here we have A and B, and we have a movement along the curve. Okay, from A to B. Now we're looking at another curve, and that is of taxi rides. Taxi rides. Okay. Now, taxi rides are a substitute good. Okay? And because the price of another good, which is train tickets. Okay, so we're looking at taxi rides now. And because of the price of another good, train tickets, which is a substitute good, has risen, then the demand curve for taxi rides is going to change. Okay, it's going to be a movement of the curve. So at 8 Rand, so your taxi rides are, I see they use 8 Rand here, 8 Rand. And at 8 Rand, originally there were four taxi rides demanded. Now they're going to demand 6. Okay. And you notice that there's a movement of the curve from A to B. Okay. So when we're focusing on the graph for taxi rides, which is a substitute for train tickets, when the price of train tickets, which is another good, changes, then there is a movement of the curve of taxi rides. Okay. And there's obviously a demand for more, so the curve moves out, moves in a positive direction. So there's going to be a little bit more demand for taxi rides. Okay, and this is what we call a substitute good. Okay, yeah.
Is there specific meaning for when you say movement of the curve? Does that mean anything?
It means that there's a movement of the demand curve. Yeah. So if you look, you look over here. So if the price of the product, so we're only looking at train tickets. Forget about that one now. We're only looking at train tickets, and we look at and all we're looking at is the price of train tickets, and everything else has been kept equal. Okay. If the price of the train tickets changes, then there's going to be a change in demand, and we're going to have a movement along this curve. Okay, so now we want to look at another good, a substitute good. So we're looking at taxi rides now. So when you focus on this, now we're saying that in terms of taxi rides, the price of another good, okay, has changed. Therefore, it's going to affect the demand curve. So the demand curve moves out of taxi rides. So there's a movement of the curve. from D1 to D2. And in an exam, if you get a question like this, this is the way to do it. And if you've got a couple of colors, okay, what I should actually do, I should have maybe used a bit of red here, and you could put A and B if you want. You can do the same over here, just to make it so it stands out a little bit. Okay, something like that. And you could even, if you want to put the other demand curve in a different color, you could do that as well. Okay, but don't spend too much time making it look pretty. If you are sitting in the, if you're doing online, you obviously can't do this. Okay, you'll still get the same question, but you'll have to give a description. So you'll have to make sure you fully understand it to be able to give a verbal description of what's going on here. Okay. So make sure you understand this. The difference between along and of. Yeah. Yeah. It was like you standing up here and you giving the lecture and you don't have this facility in front of you. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. As a result, we had a movement along the curve from point A to point B. So you try and visualize this, and then you talk about the substitute good. Because the price of another product, the substitute good, changed, then there's a movement of the curve on this one. Okay. Yeah. You can get something similar happening like this if you, for example, if you have a complementary good. Now, a very simple example that they use here are cell phones. So if the price of cell phones comes down, the demand for talk time or airtime is going to go up. So you'd also draw two graphs, and you'd have a look at the one. The one would be cell phones, and the price is coming down, so there's a movement along the curve, okay? And then you're looking at the second graph, which is airtime, and there will be a movement of the curve. So the demand curve will shift, okay? And it'll be a positive because it's a bigger demand, okay? If it's a smaller demand, obviously it's a contraction, it'll come back this way, okay? So the demand of the product will decrease. So in the notes here, they use that example for complementary goods, cell phones and airtime. So maybe have a quick look at that when you study as well. Then just to make. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. But you must also talk about the movement along the curve. It's a very important aspect of this exercise, is to demonstrate the movement of the curve, along the curve, and then movement of the curve. Okay. Yeah. This one. Yeah. This one here. Yes. If you go, the price goes up even further, then it'll be even less demand, eh? Yes. Mm. That's right. Yeah. And there's only a movement of the curve, like over here, if the price of another good changes. Okay. If the price of the good, of train ticks is changing, it's a movement along the curve. But if you're over here, and you're referring to that good over there, then there's a movement of the curve, of this one. Okay. Mm. If the price goes up again over here, then this curve's going to move again. It's going to move again. Yeah. But I mean, that's really complicating the whole situation. We're trying to keep it as simple as possible. We just want to have one movement. So there's one price move here. We're trying to illustrate what's going to happen to a substitute good. Okay. Okay, let's move on. It's quite important here to, okay, then the next thing is income. And so let's have a look at, just draw another graph, our demand curve. Okay. And what we're going to look at here is normal goods versus inferior goods. And inferior here does not mean that it's not a good product. Doesn't mean that it's an inferior product. It's just an economic term they use for something that's happening that's one wouldn't expect. Okay. So, for example, if we're looking at the example they use here is, well, anything if you think about it. Say, for example, we're looking at beef. So here we have a demand curve of beef. Okay. Now, if your income increases, then your demand for beef is going to increase. And the way that's going to happen is through a shift in the demand curve. Okay, because it's something else that's changing. Okay, it's not the price of beef that's changing. It's your income that's increasing. The price remains the same of beef, initially anyway. So you can see that your quantity demanded increases, and you go from A to B. Okay. So if we're looking at a demand curve of beef and your income increases, then typically your demand for beef is going to increase. Okay? And that's illustrated through a shift in the demand curve because it's something else that's changing other than the price. If that happens, we deem beef to be a normal good. Okay? Because your income is increasing, your demand for beef is going to increase. Okay? If, however, you have something like this, demand curve, and we're talking about, I think they use, do they use SEMP here? They use SEMP, eh? They use SEMP. So if this is a demand curve for SEMP, and your income increases, then the likelihood that you're going to continue eating SEMP is not very good, not very high. You're probably going to try something different. You're going to probably eat a bit more beef, you're going to eat a bit more chicken. So what happens here is the demand curve comes back. Okay, so at the price here, P1, you go from Q1 to Q2. So it comes back, okay, from A to B. Okay, so your demand for SEMP is going to decrease, and your demand for something else is going to increase. Okay, you're making a change in your purchase decision. We call this an inferior good. That is an inferior good. This is a normal good. Okay, where the demand curve goes out in a positive direction, it's a normal good. And when your demand for a product contracts, that is deemed to be an inferior good. And this is you only refer to this when you're talking about changes in income. Okay. I'll come to you now. Yeah. Sorry, you got your hand up first, yeah.
So that movement would be, your normal movement would be your off curve, the movement off curve.
Yeah, this is the, so,
That normal
okay, yeah. It's a movement of the curve because it's something else that's changing. It's not the price of beef that's changing, it's your income that's changing. So remember we had that function. So, sorry, not D. Quantity demand is a function of the price of the product, price of other products, income, tastes, number of people in the household, and many other things. So we're not looking at this, the price of the product, we're looking at income. So when something else changes, we're talking about a movement of the curve. Okay. You have a contraction in the quantity demanded. Yeah. Yeah.
For instance, we are talking about normal and inferior. Then what do you refer alcohol as normal or inferior?
Alcohol.
Yeah. Because alcohol, even though the prices goes up, but the demand is always going up. So I don't know how.
Yeah, so
It doesn't matter how much duties they impose on.
yeah, so when we get to elasticity, we'll start dealing with that. Yeah, when we get to elasticity, and you'll see that as I showed a little earlier, the slope of the curve is very important there. I mean, there you probably got a curve that's standing straight up like that. So it doesn't matter what happens with the price; the demand still stays the same. It's the same as cigarettes. If you've got a habit, it's very difficult to break a habit. It doesn't matter what happens to the price of the product; you're still going to buy the same amount of that good because you need your 20 cigarettes a day. That's it. What can you do? Or you need your beer or your glass of wine at the end of the day. What can you do? That's it. So what you normally do in life, you actually do without something else to make sure you can have your cigarettes or your beers or your wine or whatever. Yeah. Okay. So in a very similar fashion, if taste change, if the population changes or the number of people in the household changes, then you have these shifts of the curve. Okay. So a movement along the curve is if only the price of the product changes. Everything else has been kept equal. Okay. A movement of the curve is when something else other than the price of the product changes. The price of other products, your income, your tastes, the number of people in the household, etc., etc., etc. If you can remember that, you've gone a long way to understanding these concepts. It's whatever's in the notes will never get more complicated than that. If you know your notes or you've been through the book, you don't need the book, but if you've been through the book, and I'm going to refer to a couple of pages just now that if you can get a hold of the book, or if somebody's got a book, you take photographs of the pages before you leave, okay? Because, and it's only a few pages, about 4 or 5 pages, that pages 75 to 79, they are brilliant to, in terms of equilibrium and consumer and producer surplus. And what you do is you read it over and over until you understand it. 75 to 79. So the first time you read it, you're going to think, wow, this is Greek. I don't really understand this. Because we're going to go through it now. But don't feel uncomfortable if you don't fully understand it today. You go and sit down and you read that thing over and over until you understand it. And it'll eventually come to you. 75, 79, brilliant. 4 or 5 brilliant pages. So if you haven't got a book, grab somebody's book before you leave here now and just photograph it with those pages. Okay. Okay, so we've touched on demand now. And we've done a couple of things in demand. We've looked at the function, and we've looked at the basic demand curve, and we've looked at the difference between movements along the curve, where the price of the product changes, and we looked at movements of the curve where there are changes in any of the other elements. Okay. And everything that we're going through is in the book. Is in the notes. We're not deviating at all from the notes. I think it's best we stick closely to the notes so that you've got something to refer to. Okay, so we're not going to go through the derivation of a supply curve. It's very similar to the derivation of a demand curve. Okay, so in much the same way, you have a function, quantity supplied is a function of a number of things. The price of the product, the price of other products, okay, the price of the factors of production. Remember the factors of production? Capital, labor, entrepreneurship. Remember all those. There are four factors of production. Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Remember those. The expected future prices of products. Technology is a big one in the supply, and we'll discuss a little bit about technology as we go along. It's very important. And then the number of, in here is the number of firms in the marketplace. Okay. And then obviously there are lots of other things that will determine the quantity supplied by suppliers or firms. Okay. So it's the quantity supplied by firms, manufacturers, etc. Okay. So we have our function here. The quantity supplied is a function of the price of the product, the price of other products, the price of factors of production, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Very important. You know, if labor costs go up, it obviously affects the prices and of the product, and then obviously then affects quantity demanded. The future prices, expected future prices of products. Technology is a very important one. If technology improves, obviously supply can improve as well. Okay, at the same cost. And then the number of firms in the supply chain, and then obviously lots of other things too. Don't forget these dots. Okay, and then if we're looking at how the price of the product affects the supply of the product, and that's all, everything else being kept equal, in the same way, we do it like this. Or, ceteris paribus. You can write it like that as well. So what that means is that the quantity supplied is a function of the price of the product, everything else being kept equal. Ceteris paribus. So you can write it either way. Okay. So we've got a curve. This is price, quantity, and the curve looks like that, supply curve. And if you think about it, it's quite logical, because if the price goes from P1 to P2, the quantity supplied by a firm is going to increase. So if the price increases, the firm is going to want to produce more of the good because they can make more money. So if you look at if you look at clothes, for example, the quantity of if the price of clothing increases, then the quantity that firms want to supply is going to increase. How the demand curve behaves is something different, or We'll have a look at that just now when we put them together. Okay. Okay, so if the price of the product goes up, quantity supplied increases. And you'll see that if this is the case, that again, you have this movement along the curve. Because all we're talking about is the price of the product. So the quantity supplied increases, and there's a movement along the curve from A to B. If, on the other hand, we have our supply curve, and we have price P1, and technology improves, then the suppliers are able to produce more goods, the same price. So what happens is a movement of the curve. So now what we're looking at one of the other factors, no longer ceteris paribus. We're looking at technology. Okay. If technology improves, okay, there's a movement of the supply curve, and it's a positive movement. So you go from Q1 to Q2. Okay, so in much the same way as we looked at the demand curve, you have these movements along the curve. Okay, if we're looking at price alone, if we're looking at anything other than price, then you have movements of the curve. Okay, and it'll be a positive one if more goods can be produced. It'll be a negative one if we look at, for example, if effective production changes. So one's just got to think about it logically. If the effective production labor costs go up, then we're going to get something like this. P1, Q1. So this is, so we have, here we had tech changes. So that was a positive move. And here we're going to have labor cost changes. So we have a movement in from A to B. Because when labor costs go up, firms are not prepared to produce the same amount of product for that particular price. There will be adjustments a little bit later, but immediately what happens is that the supply curve moves backwards, and you get a contraction in the quantity supplied. Okay. Okay, so in much the same way as we dealt with movements along the curve and movements of the curve, with the demand side, on the supply side it's very similar. So if you're looking at the price of the product alone, it's a movement along the curve. If you're looking at any of these others, it's a movement of the curve. And then you have to decide whether it's going to be a positive move or a negative move. So it's going to be an increase or a contraction, expansion or contraction in quantity supplied. So it's a hell of a lot of stuff to absorb in a short space of time. If I think about the full-time students, we had 2 classes a week, and we had quite a few weeks. And, we spent time. And what I did is I paced him with this demand supply. So if they were battling a little bit, then the next lecture we'd go over a couple of things again. So we had time to sort of space it out. And that's why we didn't spend too much time with elasticity, by the way, because the guys were struggling a little bit. And by the way, we're only going up to page, in the notes, page 27. We're not doing government and agriculture, eh? So page 27 of these notes is as far as we go. Okay. Oh, it's on the window here. How's the aircon? Is it okay, or is it too cold? It's cold. Well, let's just turn it off, eh? Oh, he's turned it off. No big deal. Fine. Okay. Okay, guys. So we're going to press on now. We've dealt with demand. We've dealt with supply. Now what we're dealing with is market equilibrium. And this is where those pages that I mentioned, pages 75 to 79, are very important. In those pages, I think that they summarize demand and supply very briefly, and they talk a little bit about the movements along the curve and the movements of the curve, So it's like a bit of a summary, and it's a bit of a repetition, but a little briefer. And then they start talking about market equilibrium and consumer and producer surplus. Okay. In market equilibrium, you've got the price, quantity, you've got your demand curve, and you've got your supply curve. And please, when you draw these graphs, you must denote whether it's a demand curve or a supply curve, okay? So you must put a D or S, just to give us an indication you understand. Okay, so equilibrium, that is the equilibrium price, P1. Okay, where the two graphs intersect, where the demand curve and the supply curve intersect. That is the point of equilibrium. Okay. Point of equilibrium. Okay. So the two curves intersect, and at this price P1, this quantity Q1 will be demanded and supplied, or supplied and demanded. Okay. Whichever way you want to say it. Okay. At any other price or any other position, the market is, for this particular product, is in disequilibrium. Okay, disequilibrium. So if we talk, if the point, for example, is somewhere up here, the market is in disequilibrium. If the point is over here somewhere, the market is in disequilibrium. Okay. Anywhere away from this point, the market is in disequilibrium. Okay. And there will be forces that will come into play to make sure that our equilibrium is reinstated. Yeah. Well, there's so many more complications. This is like an ideal situation, and there are forces at play all the time, constantly moving about. So possibly not. Possibly not. And depending on the product as well. Some products maybe, some products probably never. And there are a lot of interventions like the government. Government intervene in prices. You also have monopolies, you have oligopolies. You know, there are all sorts of forces that are out there in the marketplace. So very difficult, yeah, to achieve. But maybe somewhere there's a true market for a particular product, it's possible, where no interference is possible. And I think what we're seeing now with blockchain technology, where no government and no individual can interfere, we might see a bit more price equilibrium. Okay. So at any other point, other than this point here, which is the equilibrium point, at any other point, the market for this particular product is in disequilibrium. Okay. And there are forces that are set in motion to move the market back to this point of equilibrium. Okay, and maybe it's never ever achieved, but these forces will continuously move or try and force the equilibrium or the status of equilibrium to be reinstated. Okay. Okay, let me keep this up here, disequilibrium. Equilibrium. Okay, let's have a look at another one. Price and quantity. Demand, supply. Put out. And the more often you do these, draw these graphs, the more familiar you'll become with labeling them as well. Okay, let's have a look at a situation where the price, so here we've got the equilibrium position, price and quantity, okay, where the two graphs intersect. So for example, the price is up here. Like that. C and D. So we've got a price, so P2, I should have done the other one first. A price P2 up there, okay, where at P2, so much of the product is demanded, Q2, and so much of the product, let's just call it P1. Sorry, messing you guys around. So P1, Q2 of the product is demanded, okay, in terms of the demand curve. In terms of the supply curve, at this point, Q1 is is the amount supplied. Remember, the higher the price, the more the firms want to supply, and the higher the price, the less we prepare to consume as consumers. Okay. We call this situation excess supply. Okay, because at P1, the firms are going to produce more product and they're going to supply Q1 of the product. Okay. But only Q2 is going to be demanded or bought at this particular price. So there's going to be excess product sitting out there that is not going to be purchased. We call this point excess supply. Now what happens, there are forces that come into play that bring these prices down. Down along the curves back to equilibrium. So for example, let's just have a look at a practical example. We've got firms out there that are producing clothing. And at P1, they prepare to produce Q1 clothing, but only Q2 are going to be demanded. Got this excess supply. So the suppliers there realize that they've got all this clothing sitting around. And you'll notice what happens towards the end of a season. They've got all this clothing sitting around. They don't want this clothing going into the next season. So what happens? You get a couple of suppliers out there jumping ship, and they start dropping their prices. So you can go to maybe Pick and Pay. I don't know if you've been to Pick and Pay clothes sometimes at the end of a season, and you'll start seeing a lot of clothing coming onto their stands there, and you can see that the prices come down quite dramatically. So you can, what happens then, so a couple of these suppliers start jumping ship, and they start lowering their price. And a couple of these consumers out there start seeing what's happening, and you start having a few more consumers buying the product. And then, but they still got excess supply. So what happens is those suppliers out there reckon, no, they've got to drop their prices a little bit further, and so they drop them a little bit further. So the price is coming down, they're dropping a little bit further, and the consumers realize, oh, it's coming down a little bit further, so I'll buy a little bit more of the product. But we're not yet at equilibrium. So we have to come right down to this price here before we're at equilibrium, where the quantity supplied is the same as the quantity demanded. Okay, so that's just an example that when you get to an end of a season, that suppliers are dropping their prices of clothing to try and get rid of the excess supply. Okay, until they get to a point where a point of equilibrium where the quantity supplied is exactly the same as the quantity demanded. Okay, are there any questions about that? Okay, so we call that situation excess supply. There's more product out there than the consumer is prepared to buy at that particular price. Okay. Okay, that's excess supply. Okay, let's look at the converse, which is excess demand. So we have a price P1 down here, and at P1 we have suppliers only prepared to supply Q1, but the consumers wanting to purchase Q2 of the product at that particular price. Now, what happens in this situation is that forces come into play, and we have a situation where equilibrium will eventually be restored. Okay, so we call this situation excess demand. Excess demand. Okay, so what you've got is that at a particular price, suppliers are only prepared to supply Q1 of the product, but at that same price, Q2 is supplied, which is demanded, which is far greater. So it's a situation of excess demand. So forces come into play to bring us back to equilibrium. And what happens here in practice? What happens is that the action normally starts with the consumer. There's some consumers out there that really want this product, and they prepare to pay a little bit more for the product. And the supplier realizes this and starts producing more of the product, okay? Because they can see that the supplier's prepared to, the consumer's prepared to pay a little bit more. And when the and more consumers start behaving in this fashion, okay, when they start seeing that more product is coming onto the market. And eventually, in the same fashion, the equilibrium, point of equilibrium is is reinstated. Okay. So we have excess supply and excess demand. And as I said on those pages 75 to 79, great description. If you're feeling like you're battling with it a little bit, then what I suggest is go and read that and read it until you understand it. Might take a couple of times to go through it. Okay, so we've got one more concept to cover, and then we'll take our break before we have a look at elasticity and look at the exam. Okay. And that is of consumer and producer surplus. Okay, so let's look at consumer surplus first. Now demand curve. Okay, so this is consumer surplus that we're going to discuss here. Also a difficult concept and something you might have to read in those pages, read a couple of times and it might eventually come to you. So let's take an example. So if you look at let's look at luxury motor cars, because some people will pay anything for a luxury motor car. You know, some people will only pay the price. Some people will pay anything. Maybe you've got collectors out there. You've got guys who absolutely want that model, and it's been so spoken about and so highly spoken about that, you know, certain individuals have to have that particular model of car. So you can take any car. You can take, I mean, let's look at a car that's in quite demand. So you look at let's have a look at a Porsche 911. And some people say the new model has just come out, the 2019 model has just come out, and there's certain people that have just got to have this thing. So what happens is that Porsche set a price, okay, P1, and at P1, Q1 of that particular model are being demanded. But there are some people that to get, you know, I know there's one particular model called they call it a GD2 RS, which came out in limited supply. Okay, so limited supply, and the price was set by the manufacturers. Okay, but there's some individuals that they have to have that motor car. Come what may, they got to have that motor car. There are only, say for example, there are only 10 that have been brought into South Africa. There's some individuals that just have to have that thing, and there's more than 10 people that want that motor car. You'll get some guys, for example, say this thing is going for 5 million rand. There's some guys who will pay 10 million rand for their motor car because they've got a collection and they have to have this motor car. It's a rare car that only comes once every 5 years. They've got to have it. They'll probably pay up here for the car. There might be others that will be prepared to pay more. But there are definitely people, a lot of people out there, that are prepared to pay more than the listed price for that motor car. Okay. And what we call this is consumer surplus. And it's this shaded area. Get another color pen. This shaded area below the curve, also doesn't work. Over here. So it's the shaded area in this triangle here. That is called the consumer surplus. Because if you add up all the individuals that are prepared to pay the higher price, they're all different prices that the people are prepared to pay. You can see it actually becomes a solid area above this price P1 over here. And that they call the consumer surplus. So you can actually calculate that, consumer surplus. You can remember calculating the area of a triangle. So if you've got a couple of figures on here, you can actually calculate what that area is. I'm just telling you just out of interest. We're not going to ask you to calculate the area of that triangle, but just out of interest, if you wanted to, as a manufacturer, you could probably calculate that. Okay, it's just the area of the triangle. It's because if you look at all the different prices, you can put between here and up here, you can have 1,000, you can have 100 prices, you can have 1,000 different prices. And there will be people that'll be prepared, there will be so many cars of that particular model that'll be demanded. So it starts looking like a solid area above that price. Okay, and we call that consumer surplus. It's the area above this price, above which some consumers will jump ship and pay a little bit more or quite a lot more than the listed price. Okay.
And what do you call that triangle? That square underneath the triangle.
What, this over here?
Yeah.
No, there's nothing for that. No, nothing for that. No. Okay, so that's consumer surplus. And then the other one, producer surplus. Yeah, you guessed right. Price, quantity. Okay. At P1, so much quantity is supplied. They prepare to supply. Firms are prepared to supply so much quantity. Okay. But there's some suppliers out there that are prepared to supply a little bit of product for lower prices. So you come and take a price a little bit further down. There'll be a couple of suppliers that are prepared to supply some of the product. Some might even come as far down as this. They'll supply, say for example, it's a certain range of clothing, okay? And at this particular price, so much is demanded. But there'll be some suppliers out there who will actually manufacture or import that clothing, and they're prepared to actually drop the prices a little bit further. Sometimes they use it as a loss leader. If you go into a supermarket, sometimes you find products on the shelves that are actually placed there to attract you into the shop, and they call them loss leaders. They're actually losing money on that particular product. They know when you come in that you're going to push your trolley around the place, and you're going to put a whole lot of other products into the trolley. So at the end of the day, they're selling a trolley full of product, and the one little thing inside there is the loss leader. Yet they've got you inside the shop to do your shopping. As opposed, maybe it's Pick and Pay, as opposed to going to Checkers. You think, wow, while I'm here, I might as well do all my shopping. So there are some suppliers who prepare to drop their prices. So in the same way, we get a shaded area here we call producer surplus. And in the same way, you can actually calculate that area. Okay, it's called producer surplus. And as I say, if you don't understand it right now, if you read that those pages there, you'll over and over, you'll get the hang of it. Okay. And then when we go through the exam after the break, you'll see whether we're going to get questions in that particular area or not. Okay. Okay, guys, so let's if there are no questions, let's have a break, about 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll resume with elasticity and the exam.